In case you missed it, there's a pretty big event coming up in November. On November 5th, to be exact. It's called Election Day, and let's face it, it's all we're being bombarded with on TV, radio, newspapers, and of course, social media. But for all the talk, all the issues that are being raised, there's one thing that isn't being talked about, not in the least. In fact, as I'm filming this, I haven't seen a single politician, not one on either side, bringing these things up. Not one. What is it, or more precisely, they? The issues that men and boys face in today's society. Oh, sure, some skirt around some of them, in some ways talking about how we need to preserve family or using other code words that they like, which are really nothing more than veiled put downs of men and fathers. But when it comes right down to it, the fact of the matter is, much like a B-2 bomber, those issues don't even come up on their radar, let alone be talked about or addressed. Which brings up a couple of questions, ones that I'm going to answer in this video. And I'm sorry to say, gentlemen, but many of you watching this aren't going to like what I'm about to tell you. The first question we need to ask is why? Why don't politicians talk about men's issues, let alone do something about them? And who's to blame for that? Now, if you ask men that, and I have for years now, they'll often cite various reasons or give excuses, usually following whatever way they tend to lean politically. For example, if they lean left, they'll say things like, well, we need to focus on women's rights and equality before we can pay attention to the issues that men and boys face. If they lean right, they'll usually start talking about family and how men need to step up and be better husbands and fathers. And that's exactly what you'll hear and have heard from politicians as well. They never want to discuss the actual issues. They're always looking to take the focus away from directly speaking about them or addressing them, and instead put it elsewhere. To them, men's issues are controversial and something to be avoided at all costs. Which brings us to the second question, which is why? Why is that the case, and how did it come to be that way? The reason, my friends, is very simple, and it's one that I've had dozens of legislators at every level, federal, state, and local, say over and over again. Not just this year, but every single year in the almost 30 years that I've been speaking out on men's issues. Because they hear from women and women's groups pretty much on a daily basis about the issues that women face. While at the same time, they hear nothing, literally nothing, from men or men's groups about the issues men face. And the few that do hear something, well, they'll usually tell you what they do hear is threats and anger directed at them with no real substance or reasoning behind it. I hate to break it to you folks, but while you may not want to believe it, politicians are human beings. And like almost all human beings, they aren't going to respond or be open to listening to someone who is screaming and yelling at them. You wouldn't, and you know it. So why do you think they would? The reality is, like it or not, the squeaky wheel gets the grease, and men simply don't speak up for themselves or fight for their rights. Instead, they offer up excuses like, I'm too busy working, or it's not going to do any good, so why bother? And this isn't new. This has been going on for generations now. And frankly, I already know it isn't going to change anytime soon. In fact, as men retreat more and more into their own worlds, too afraid to fight, too afraid to rock the boat because it might come back to haunt them, it's only going to get worse. In the past few months, I've spoken to well over 100 sitting politicians and many of the candidates who are looking to replace them in the upcoming election. The truth of the matter is, I can count on one hand the number of them that have heard from any man or men's group about the issues men face. And as I said earlier, the very few that did just heard ranting and raving. Let that sink in for a moment, gentlemen, and ask yourself this. Why would any politician whose main goal, in fact only goal, is in most cases to get elected or re-elected, why would they put any thought or energy into speaking about or addressing the issues men and boys face when men aren't raising them? or if they are, only doing so in anger, especially when they're hearing from women about women's issues literally every single day. I can't tell you how many of them have looked at me when I brought up various issues, ones like the fact that there are 0 domestic violence shelters for men in the entire state of North Carolina, like a deer in the headlights. In many cases, they genuinely aren't aware of the issues because they've never heard about them. In others, they know the issues exist, but won't address them out of fear. Yes, you heard that right. Fear. Because perception is reality. And the perception, and rightly so, is that men simply don't care about their issues. And they certainly aren't willing to stand up and fight for them. While at the same time, women do. And since it's all about getting votes, not to mention campaign donations to get elected, why would politicians put any effort into addressing men's issues and risk pissing off those women who are far more likely to vote based on their issues and, more precisely, how they feel about them? That is the reality, and anyone who doesn't accept and realize that is a fool. The truth of the matter is, while men want to put all the blame on politicians, it's largely their own fault why things are the way they are. And until men are willing to stand up, speak up, and actually make an effort, it isn't going to change. If every man watching this video took 5 minutes to call each of the politicians that are running for re-election and the candidates who are seeking to unseat them and ask them, what are you doing about the issues I face as a man? What are you doing on the issues that all men and boys face? Well, my friends, things would change, and change pretty quickly. How do I know? Because that's exactly what women and the women's groups are doing, have been doing for decades, and are going to continue to do. Do you really think abortion became the issue it has in this election just out of the blue? No, it's because women's groups have made it a priority and are contacting campaigns over and over again, every single day, asking, where do you stand? What are you going to do? Then they're acting based on the response they are getting and going after the ones that oppose their position and supporting the ones that do. And before you all go screaming, but, what about the media? They only cover women's issues, right? Well, you are right in saying that, but ask yourself again, why? Well, my friends, it's for the very same reasons. Despite what you might think about the main agenda of media outlets, the reality is their main goal is to make money. Mostly because if they don't, they'll cease to exist. It is, to use industry vernacular, about eyeballs and ears. And this is especially true now in the social media era. Media outlets ask themselves, who is more likely to watch? Who is more likely to speak up either for or against their coverage? Who is more likely to like or comment on a social media post? And most importantly, who is more likely to hold it against their advertisers or buy more or less of their advertisers' product, depending on the coverage? The answer is women, and by a wide margin. And the media knows that. They know full well that in general, if they don't support women's groups and women's issues, those groups will target them, or more precisely, their advertisers, the ones that generate their income. Whereas men won't lift a finger. This isn't conjecture, it's fact, and it's been proven time and time again. The fact of the matter is the women's groups are very well organized and run coordinated campaigns going to politicians of both parties every single day, asking them, what are you going to do about X issue? Abortion being the biggest, of course. Hell, they do the same thing to content creators like myself. They have entire Discord servers where they plan mass reporting attacks on those of us who dare to speak out on men's issues, trying to get us shut down or banned. And I hate to say it, but they've been very successful at it. There hasn't been a week in the past 2 years that I haven't had to deal with a mass reporting attack, almost always done in the middle of the night when I'm likely to be sleeping and thus able to respond to it. And it's why I and many others like myself have had multiple accounts banned or have had to spend hours of our valuable time each week dealing with the attacks rather than focusing on the issues. Sorry, gentlemen, but women are wiping the floor with us, and we've got no one to blame but ourselves, because what do men for the most part do? I'm sorry to say, nothing. Abso-freaking-lutely nothing. Instead of investing what would be no more than an hour of their time in the next few weeks to reach out to all the politicians running and saying, do you care about the issues men face? And if so, what will you do about them? Men will do as they've done to their doom for years now, which is, as I just said, nothing. They'll stand by and let the women's groups control the narrative, and in many ways control the election, only to bitch and moan later on how unfair things are and why doesn't anyone do anything about it. The bottom line is this, gentlemen. You have two choices. You can either keep doing what men have done for decades now, the aforementioned nothing, or you can do what real men should do. Start taking action to fix the problem. Start taking a stand, not just for yourselves, but for your children. If you want things like shared parenting or child support reform, if you want issues like boys falling behind in school or the issue of rampant false allegations in schools, the workplace, hell everywhere to be addressed, if you want male victims of domestic violence to have shelter and services to help them, if you want other issues like paternity fraud or mandatory DNA testing to be put on the table, if you want the bias against men that society has, or a host of other issues I can think of to be discussed and brought about, then you're going to have to quit making excuses and do something. Gentlemen, if you aren't willing to stand up and speak out, if you aren't willing to take at most an hour or two of your time in the next few weeks to contact politicians, if you aren't willing to go to the media and ask them, why aren't you covering men's issues? If you aren't willing to do anything but piss and moan after the fact, then you have no one to blame but yourselves. It's time we all either put up or shut up.